Cool.
5, 4, 3, 2. No, wait.
Okay, so we're live again from the basement of the European Parliament. I'm just going to tweet the link here so that everyone can join us and ask whatever questions they have. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Luke Ming Flanagan of Midlands Northwest. Thank you so much for making the time.
No problem, Naomi.
Okay, so I'm just about to post that we're having this chat. Left Independent MEP Luke Ming Flanagan, and we'll be speaking is really important. Cool. So I'm just writing if anyone has any questions for us, just to post them here. Cool. Tweet sent. All right. So thank you so much for joining me. Can I ask you a really simple question first? Should I call you Luke or Ming?
I don't mind.
Okay.
People walk up to me on the street and they go, and they just give up. They go, what will I call you? I don't mind. They call me, my family called me Ming at this stage, so because my father's name is Luke, so it keeps it simple.
It differentiates. I see. Very good. Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for making the time. So what I want to really talk to Luke/Ming about today is the Common Agricultural Policy. You might have heard about this. It essentially, the EU underpins what prices you pay in the supermarket for whatever you're buying, whether that's milk or vegetables or whatever, because farmers, in order to make a living, rely on these subsidy payments from the EU. That's how we've set up our economy and our food system. And any changes to that has massive implications. It has huge implications for the farming industry, for agriculture, for the ordinary farmer, and also ultimately for what people pay in the supermarket. It's a massive package. It's the single biggest amount of money that the EU spends on anything, and it's changed over time, and there's a 7-year package, right, that renews every 7 years. Every time it renews, there's this huge negotiation about how to change it because people are unhappy with it for various reasons, and there's so much money at stake. There's so many interest groups involved with it. It's a massive, huge negotiation, and Luke has actually had kind of a front row seat to the negotiation of the current package that's going to come into force, because you were what's called the rapporteur, right, for the left group.
I was a shadow rapporteur for the left group, and the biggest group, as it turns out, they got the rapporteur position, but we work, the 8 MEPs who get that position, all work together to put together a parliament position from what the European Commission has put out there as a draft.
Right. So I was explaining, if anyone was on the live yesterday, about the division of powers between the different EU institutions, where the Commission proposes something, then the Parliament and the Member States come up with their position on whatever this thing happens to be, and then finally all 3 of them come together once they've got those positions to come to like one general consensus that passes and that becomes law. And that negotiation process is where the rapporteurs come in for the different political groups. Now the left group is a relatively small political group.
We are the smallest political group, but we still get one seat at the table, and when you're in the room with other people, in fairness, if you have a good idea and they agree with it, they don't care whether you're in the smallest group.
Right. It's actually an interesting fact that even though the left group is really small, there's a bunch of Irish MEPs in it. Like there's you, there's Claire Daly, Mick Wallace, and also Sinn Féin's
and Chris McManus. Right. And in the previous term there were 3 Sinn Féin MEPs. Okay, so it's kind of switched from 3 Sinn Féin, 1 independent the last time around to 3 independents, 1 Sinn Féin this time around.
How do you guys work together? Because actually you represent kind of different strands of politics, right?
Well, I suppose the name of our group, we are a confederal group, and we work together as best we can. But then again, all the other groups do that as well, as I discovered throughout the CAP process. The S&D are a far bigger group. They're a left-wing group as well. Some people might say otherwise, but they take totally disparate positions. Maria Neuchel was the shadow rapporteur on the file I was working on for the S&D, and I like Maria, but I have to say her voice wouldn't be completely listened to in the S&D, and there is another wing, and she voted against it actually, the proposals in the Agriculture Committee a couple of weeks ago. So we're all kind of disparate, but we work together as best we can. We have more in common than we have differing.
So because of the constituency that you represent, Midlands, Northwest, you're particularly interested in this agricultural issue and the issue of EU subsidies. Like, maybe, would you say that it's correct that actually the European Parliament is the most important place and the most influential place in terms of farming, the issue of agriculture and what our food system and what farmers get paid? Well,
in the whole trialogue process, we're not all equal. The council and ourselves are equal, and really the commissioner there as adjudicators. But we do have an influence on it. You could be cynical at times and say, well, we don't in certain ways, but overall we do have some influence. I'm looking at the regulation that's going to be voted on in November here in the plenary, and there are words there that I wrote down on a piece of paper, and now they're going to appear in the regulation, in particular when it comes to peatlands and wetlands and a conditionality called GAIAC 2. We got a wording in there which was very, very important for us, and if it wasn't here, it wouldn't have happened.
That's a really interesting kind of concrete explanation of actually how the European Parliament works, right? Because it can be difficult to follow when there's thousands of amendments, there's hundreds and hundreds of MEPs. This stuff goes through many, many different rounds of negotiation before the sausage comes out of the factory, right?
Yes.
But actually you can trace, particular words that end up going through because of this consensual based policy making. Even though you're in a minority group, you can actually have an impact on what ultimately comes out, right?
Oh, you can. You can basically build up alliances. Our group get on very, very well with the Green group, and we get on quite well with the S&D. And between the three of the groups, we don't have a majority, but it's hard to get some stuff through unless we agree. So we use that. And in particularly on convergence, the big one for me, and convergence being the creating a situation where everyone ends up getting the same payment for the same amount of land. On that, we got quite a lot of agreement there, because you're moving to a fairer system, a system where people are treated more equally. And last time I looked, that's what socialism was meant to be about. So they went along with that.
Okay, so convergence is this issue which is really, really important to you. You also mentioned the word trilogues, which, just to explain if anyone's unfamiliar with that, that's just the word for when the Commission, the Member States and the Parliament get together for their negotiations to find the final version of whatever is going to become EU law. So yeah, on this internal convergence thing, essentially what it is back in the day when these agricultural subsidies first were introduced by the EU, it was basically about food security. It was a post-World War II thing where they wanted to make sure that there was always enough food in Europe, and the money was tied to productivity. So it was about how much farmers were producing. Now, ultimately, this became dysfunctional in its own way. We had the famous wine lakes and milk lakes, and also it's blamed for intensifying farming, which had a bad impact on biodiversity and the climate, because it intensified farmers to farm more, mow the fields, not leave alone the special ecosystems and stuff like that there are. So what the current CAP negotiations are about, there's loads of different issues there, but one of the major ones is how to tweak the rules so that to incentivize farmers to protect the environment, to produce less carbon, to protect ecosystems. And this is tricky, right? Because although it's much more difficult to measure how to reward a farmer for leaving alone a pond or whatever you have, so it's really tricky. On the internal convergence thing, right? You can jump in if I say something wrong, because you're really the expert on this. But basically, there was a past system where, because these subsidies were tied to productivity, it means that currently, until now, in farmers, some farmers just get a much bigger payment per hectare of land that they farm than others.
It was based on your productivity of 25 years ago, though,
right.
And that was the problem. And whether that was a good judge of productivity or not is up for debate. But there's one thing for sure: you were paying people under the current cap, not the one we've just reviewed, for what they did 25 years ago. And the theory was you gave more per hectare to a farmer the more productive that they were. But if you look at Department of Agriculture figures from 2017, and you look at the range of payments from €0 per hectare up to €1,000 per hectare at the time, you will see quite clearly, these are the department's own figures, that those on some of the lowest payments, €100 per hectare, €200 per hectare, in fact around €200 per hectare, they were just as productive. In other words, they had as many livestock per hectare as those who were getting €1,000 per hectare. And going into these negotiations, I would obviously be lobbied by all farming organisations. And one of the main arguments that the IFA would have been putting across to me as to why the current system was fair, Irish Farmers Association, was because they were more productive. But the reality is, even on that narrow idea of productivity, in other words, having more animals on your land, it was not true. So going into this cap, the status quo was that some farmers got, for every hectare of land, they got up to €700 per hectare. Whereas the lowest amount that anyone got was 160.
Right.
So on average, for every hectare in Ireland, farmers get 265. So under the previous cap, the least you could give anyone was 60% of the average, which worked out at €160 per hectare.
Okay.
And my main goal going into these negotiations was to change that situation and to create a situation whereby all farmers were given the exact same amount per hectare. And the logic behind it was that all farmers have to do the exact same thing per hectare, but all farmers weren't getting the same thing. So I tried to change that, and to change that, what I attempted to do was to get 100% convergence, meaning all payments would converge at the same point.
Right.
So
yeah, this convergence word just means ending the difference between the amounts that farmers are getting per hectare. And it was actually proposed by the European Commission something like a decade ago. They actually wanted to make this happen. Most member states have already actually introduced this, but Ireland hasn't. Ireland is kind of lagged behind the others on this. And it's actually very political, because the way that it would work is if we were to suddenly even out all the payments between all the farmers, it would affect different parts of Ireland very differently. Midlands, Northwest, in to gain a lot from that, right?
Well, those on what would have traditionally been called the worst lands, which are actually the from a biodiversity point of view, are actually the best lands, they were getting the least. And those who were on the best lands, in the Golden Vale, etc., they were getting the most. So it's kind of a perverse system of giving the most to people who have the easiest land to farm, and the least to those who have the most difficult land to farm. But what I was attempting to do in this was to force the Irish government to do it, because the Irish government were free to do this after the last cap. But Simon Coveney, who was Minister for Agriculture at the time, and Ireland had the presidency of the EU at the time, chaired the trilogues the last time. And he got a derogation for countries like Ireland not to have to do this. And all they had to do was a minimum or a maximum of, they only had to do up to 60%. So what I have brought in is, what my amendment has done is it forces the government to give more money to these farmers, as opposed to leaving them the choice to do it. So Ireland could do this today if they wanted. 19 out of the 27 countries have already done it. So it's not some sort of radical idea that Luke Ming-Flanagan dreamed up of. It's actually the status quo for an awful lot of countries.
Right.
And the argument that it would affect the most productive farmers, well, if you're ever making an argument, if there's a test case out there to have a look at, the best way is to look at that. Well, in the case of the 19 countries that went with convergence, including Germany, it did not affect productivity. So from that point of view, I wouldn't have had any worries.
Because obviously there's arguments against this. The Irish Farmers Association will say this will affect the farmers that employ the most people. So it's going to have knock-on effects on people's jobs if you reduce the payments that some people are getting in the sort of like big, what they would say the big productive farms. And also it's massively politically sensitive, because in the heartlands of like the beef finishing areas, they vote for Fine Gael. It's very sensitive in many constituencies where politicians
well,
are
in the heart of Midlands Northwest, where the vast majority of farmers would benefit from convergence, they still vote for Fine Gael, but that's a story for another day. And maybe being able to tell this story might let people know who stands for what.
Well, I will be interviewing all the Fine Gael MPs as well, hopefully, and I'm sure they'll have another view on that,
Of
which
course,
we can use.
of course.
So you were saying that you're a shadow rapporteur. How do you actually manage to get that position? Because that's interesting in itself, right? That you managed to get this front seat at the table.
Well, all the time on the Agriculture Committee, there's new files coming forward, whether it's to do with competition, whether it's opinions on things, or whether it's resolutions. And this particular file it's a legislative file. It's a big one. So before every Agriculture Committee meeting, there's a coordinators meeting, and there's a list of stuff put out there. Will we do these at the Agriculture Committee? And there's certain stuff chosen. And then it's sent out to all the political groups. Would you be interested in covering this file, that file, or the other file? So I had covered quite a few files in the first couple of years that I was here on different areas. I actually covered the file on the mid-term review of the last CAP, which was called the Omnibus Proposal. Wherever they use that language, I do not know, but that's why they called it that. So I knew that this CAP file was coming down the line, and no more than someone who's looking forward to a big Christmas dinner, you mightn't eat too much before it, so you'll have an appetite for it. Well, I kind of stood back for about a year beforehand, didn't take too many files, so that when this file came up, I could legitimately say, I'll take this file. I have plenty of time on my hands. I haven't got so many files so far. And after a bit of to-ing and fro-ing with other MEPs, I got to shadow the file. And since then, I've also become coordinator for our group. So I'm now part of a meeting that takes place before the Agriculture Committee meetings, which decides what's on the agenda. So it means I'm on the stage with the main actors all the time. But on this file, it meant I was one of 8 MEPs who would be in the room when it came to putting together the Parliament position, and then subsequently be in the room when we went to the other 2 institutions to hammer out what the final deal would be.
And your experience is this has been quite successful, right? You put yourself forward, you had this particular amendment, you argued strongly for it. Ultimately, it did get through to 80% convergence, so not 100%. All of the payments have to be same, but they can't be less than 80%, right? That's the ultimate
85%.
finding. I was wrong. 85%. Thank you very much. So what happens now? Because this now goes to the national level. This law is now passed here.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
The way I look at it, it's like you get a stick and you throw it in a river and you chase after it and you watch it going under certain bridges and you keep following it. I originally put that amendment in December 2018. And it was an amendment to what the Commission's original position was, which came out, first of all, in early 2018. That proposal was that we have 100% convergence by the end of this CAP, by 2027. There were 2 other MEPs, as far as I can understand, because there were thousands of amendments put in. So we went through this to make sure we weren't leaving anyone out. There were 2 other MEPs who put in an amendment, the same amendment, an S&D MEP and a Green MEP. And we ended up in a situation whereby we had to vote on this on our committee. And there are thousands of amendments. So in order that you don't have to vote on them all, they're all bunched together where they are similar in a thing called compromise amendments.
Okay.
So my amendment looking for 100% convergence was put together in a compromise amendment by the Greens, the S&D and our group. And there was another compromise amendment put together by other groups, the biggest group, the EPP and the S&D, which actually agreed with what the Commission wanted, which was only 75% convergence. And even though there was an S&D MEP...
This is the council that wanted 75%, right?
Yes.
So the member state governments...
Pardon?
It was the member state government.
Well, the council didn't say what it wanted yet. It wasn't in the game.
Okay.
We were hammering out what the Parliament position was going to be. So I put in 100. It was to be voted at the Agriculture Committee in April of 2019. But we had quite a bit of drama in the week before that vote, because what order things are voted on is very important. So if what we tried to get done was that our compromise amendment of 100% would get voted on first. Because if it didn't, and the two big parties' compromise got voted on first and got passed, ours would never have been voted on. And no one would have known who was for or against 100% convergence. But from our experience here, we knew that legally it had to be, what had to be voted on first was the position that was furthest from the original Commission proposal. And our 100% was further from the Commission proposal than what the committee agreed on, the 75%.
Okay.
And we finally convinced them to let us vote on that first. And it was good we did, because it passed by 2 votes. It was supported by Sinn Féin. Mairead McGuinness abstained on it. But very, very, very importantly, even though they tried to get in ahead of us and to stop us doing this, a couple of members from the S&D and the EPP actually voted for our compromise, including a man called Herbert Dorfman, who would be, he'd be the most important person in the EPP in agriculture in this parliament.
Okay.
He voted for it. So we ended up with a situation where that then became the committee position. It then subsequently became the Parliament's position that we would try and get 100% in the negotiations. So we ended up in a situation going into the trilogues where on one side of the room we had the Parliament. We want 100%. So let's say you're in the mart, you're trying to sell an animal. We want 100 for our animal.
Yeah.
And the person on the other side of the room, the Commission, were saying, well, you know, we really don't want to go that far. The Commission were proposing 75. So because the Parliament position was 100 and the other argument was 75, it was inevitably going to end up somewhere in the middle. Whereas if the committee and the Parliament position had only been 75 and the Council's position had been 75, there would have been no negotiation on that, and it would never have went upwards. So us putting it that far out at 100% forced the negotiations to look at moving towards closer to 100%. And in the end, on the final day of the final big trialogue last June, this was all hammered out on the last day. We were humming and hawing about it. We kept saying, no, we want you to go to 100%. We knew it wasn't going to happen because there wasn't enough support for it at council level. Ireland would have been fighting really, really hard against it, as much as any other country. So it ended up at 85% convergence. And the important thing here is that is a minimum that the government can now do. And it's,
they must do that.
They must do a minimum of that between now and 2027. The question is, how fast will they do it? Will they move from 60 to 85 all in the last year, or will they do it 5% at a time? But there's one thing for definite. They have to do this. And during the negotiations, I think we had a very strange situation where our minister, Charlie McConalogue, was involved in the negotiations, obviously, with the council, and would have been feeding into that position. He would not tell us his position. He said he wanted maximum flexibility to decide what was best for Ireland. Well, my view was, when they had flexibility, they went for the minimum amount of redistribution, so we shouldn't give them flexibility. The situation now, and it will pass in the Parliament in November, is that he now must go towards a minimum of 85%, but it's a minimum. And what I will be doing, and I'm doing it here now, is he said he wanted flexibility to make up his own mind. Well, the minimum, in his own backyard, Donegal gains the most out of this, to the guts of about 70 million euros between now and the end of the cap. He now has the freedom to decide whether he stops at a minimum of 85% convergence for his neighbours, or whether he goes the whole way to 100%. And what it means in real terms for the people that I represent in Midlands Northwest, and for some areas outside that, like farmers in rich areas like Meath, there are small farmers, they're getting bad payments as well. It will mean to Midlands Northwest, if they do it to the maximum, it will mean hundreds of millions of euros transferred from the richest farmers to the poorest farmers. And for me, it will make it quite clear it'll make it more sustainable to farm in the areas that these people live in. And also, it will be the biggest boost to the rural economy that they've had for decades. Because there's people listening to this, and I said there's a few people have tuned out because they're going, farming is very boring, I don't understand it.
Yeah.
But the reality is, if you live in Roscommon, or you live in Mayo, or you live in Sligo, and if you're a hairdresser, or you're a carpenter, or you're a plumber, or you're a mechanic, this money will end up in your pocket. 11 million extra for Leitrim alone over the lifetime of the cap. And that money gets spent in the local area, and it can benefit. And I have to say, I'm delighted that it was passed. But I hope that Charlie McConalogue is true to his word, and he makes use of the flexibility and doesn't do what previous Irish governments have done, which is to go for the minimum.
The reason that the Irish government argues for flexibility is because they say this broad brush EU level law doesn't fit the granular, diverse situation that we actually have on the ground. So we want to be able to have that flexibility. Also for political reasons, they don't want to dramatically suddenly take too much money away from some farms. They don't want people to go bankrupt if they've got really tight margins and they've been relying on what they've been getting so far. But what's really interesting to hear in that story is how, you know, you used your position and in collaboration with others actually got this EU level law to force Ireland to go further than it otherwise would if it would.
What's even more interesting is I got elected in 2014 on the basis that I didn't want Europe telling Ireland what to do. But I have to say, in my experience dealing with the Commission here on agriculture, I'd have a lot more time for them than I would for our own Department of Agriculture. If they come up to my office to meet with me, or I can meet with them at any time, I'd be waiting a long time to get a meeting with the Department of Agriculture in Ireland. So while it kind of irks me that we have to be forced to do it, but the simple facts are there. When we had the freedom to do the right thing, we did not do the right thing. There is an argument that is being put out there that, you know, there are two variables to look at when you look at what farmers get paid. Obviously, there's the amount per hectare.
Yeah.
But then there are the number of hectares that you have. So what is being said as an argument not to do convergence is you have some people on €600 for every hectare, but they're small farmers and they're on 20 hectares and they're intensive beef finishers. And you say you're trying to help small farmers, their funding will be reduced. It will. But what we don't hear is there is a mechanism there called CRIS. You're on about acronyms. This one will really lose you. But it's basically the redistributive payment for income support. And under this system, and in this cap, it passed, the Irish government has to slice a minimum of 10% of the overall cap budget and pay it out on the first few hectares. So in other words, someone on 500 hectares, they're getting paid all that same amount of money per hectare for every one of them. Under this system, you get more for the first 20 hectares. And if you look at the modelling that's been put out there in the draft CAP strategic plan that's done by Ireland, it's quite clear already they're trying to get out of that because they've done modelling on 5% and on 10%. And there's only one way you'll get out of redistributing 10%. That's if you can prove it's been redistributed in another way. But they're being dragged kicking and screaming into this new world. And the new world is more money will end up going to small farmers and people on more difficult land to farm on. So basically, I hear this argument, you're hitting small farmers who are intensive. There's a way around that. But as it seems to be in this debate, when there's a solution to something, then there's a way around it. And it doesn't really suit their whole agenda, the people who are saying this. They never discuss it. I don't hear anyone on about the CRIS payment. I don't hear much about it in the farming media. But that deals with the problem of the intensive small farmer, which they were looking to try and protect. There's only one problem if they do that. Then they hit people on really, really high money. And I don't think there's an appetite to do that as well, because there was one other mechanism to stop people getting insane amounts of money, as in hundreds and hundreds of thousands. And that's...
This is like the level you can only get a max amount, and after that,
Well, just
no
to
more,
confuse
kind of.
people even more, it's called capping. Cap. In other words, putting a limit on the maximum payment that you can get.
Yeah, so the cap of
But
the
what,
cap.
but what was agreed
Yeah.
in the final regulation is so loose that if you're a farmer out there and you're currently getting more than €100,000, if you can't get an accountant that can't get you to hold on to all your money, I suggest you fire them, because there are so many loopholes that capping doesn't exist. What they introduced, and there was a big push for this in Ireland, was, well, if the farmer is getting €200,000 and you then cap his payment at 100,000, I'm employing people. They'll all have to lose their jobs and I won't be able to afford to pay them anymore. So what they have inserted into the new cap is that you can take account of 50% of the wages. So if you're on 100 grand and you're paying, or you're getting 200,000 of a payment, and you have 100,000 of that going out on wages, or 200,000 going out on wages, you can claim it back. So you lose nothing.
Right.
So under that capping system, what has been agreed is that a farmer who is on only 10 or 20,000 a year won't be able to pay someone to do all his labour, but he'll have to compete against someone who will be able to pay someone to come in and cut the stuff, come in and milk from, and take it off his overall top line. So
There still remain these incentives for larger farmers.
There is,
farmers.
yeah, there is. But from the point of view of the basic payment for every hectare, it's definitely good news.
It's an improvement.
It is, oh yeah, without doubt an improvement, and I wish he'd go the whole way. But it's definitely a great start.
The other argument about the small farmers as well is that they were being penalised under the current system, even though they're the more eco-friendly farmers, which I think is a valid point to make, right? Because half of the sort of debate has been about how to make it more green, how to, not to incentivise environmental destruction. But can I ask you something quickly?
I got to say this while I think of it, because I'd be kicking myself otherwise. Probably the biggest thing with this new cap is that it has been nationalised. In that, now, in order to satisfy cap, what each country has to do is they've got to put together a national plan.
Right.
And the theory is good, and I like the idea. Like, the needs of Spain, an arid country, are going to be completely different to a country like Ireland. So we now put together CAP strategic plans. Previously, it was pretty much all from high. You do this, you do X, Y, and Z.
So the law would come out and then member states just had to follow it.
Yeah.
But now they have to say, this is how we're going to implement it.
Yeah.
And the Commission is actually going to come in and sort of check their homework and say, like, okay, no,
and I'm
this,
going to be
that.
looking over the Commission's shoulder and going, Ireland is doing this. How are they allowed to do that? That doesn't make sense. It doesn't stick with what you said they were meant to do in the CAP.
Yeah.
So there are now going to be plans from basically 29 plans, because Belgium got a derogation to put in 2 plans for their country.
Okay.
But there, at the moment in Ireland, there is a process of putting together this plan. And as is tradition in Ireland, the consultation period took place for a couple of weeks in the middle of August, when everyone was getting ready for their kids to go back to school, or whether people were on holidays, etc. But that consultation process has taken place, and submissions have been made. I have made submissions that we do 100% convergence, that we maximise what we're going to do for the environment, etc. And we now basically, I think by the end of this year, we have to have a plan sent back to the Commission. And we have told the Commission quite clearly, my office, that we will be watching it every step of the way. Because if they're going to have certain rules, and it has to be done that way, well, then it's going to have to be done that way. Because my fear is, not my fear, I'm watching it going on. My fear is that Ireland will reach a reasonable level on the environment, in the same way as you could argue you reach a reasonable level on the temperature of your hands if you put one hand into boiling water and you put the other hand into 20 or into 0.
Yeah.
You could say, on average, it's kind of nice temperature. And my worry with this plan, and I'm seeing it, is that what they seem to be planning on doing is that one part of the country will drive on with intensification, and the rest of the country will have to do all of the environmental stuff, all of the climate stuff, but the intensive will be allowed to drive on, and the west of Ireland will have to do all of the hard
double
work.
Load kind of.
And some people might say, well, you know, if that's the way you want to go, or if that's the way we have to do it, do it. I don't think that's a good way to do it. I think we need biodiversity all over the island of Ireland. But it's an even worse way to do it if you do it the way I see them planning. Not only will the west of Ireland and the western seaboard have to do all of the work, they'll get nothing for it. They will get nothing for it. They will get less than anyone else. And it's a bit like you have someone causing trouble in a class and someone who works really hard in class, and you give detention to the person who is working hard, and you praise the person who's always causing the problems. And in this CAP strategic plan, that the draft that they put together, it seems to be like they're going down that road. I hope not, because we have a Green Party in government in Ireland now. So it isn't just Fianna Fáil's plan, Charlie McConaughey's plan, or Fine Gael's plan, or Simon Coveney's plan. It's the government's plan. So we're going to be watching it. There was complaints that it wouldn't do enough for the environment. You could very, very easily argue that. The minimum figures are not very ambitious.
But you could do more.
But they are minimum figures. Minimum figures. And we can go further. At the moment, on eco schemes, you have to do a minimum of 25%. But with the European Union, there's always a get out. A minimum with a learning period for the first couple of years. And if you don't learn so fast, we'll let you off. Well, the Green Party don't have to go along with that. And they don't have to go along with the measly 25%. And they can go further with it. And that's why I'm actually going to vote for this.
Okay.
If I didn't live in Ireland, I wouldn't vote for this.
Okay.
I'm voting for it because convergence, they're going to force convergence on a country that doesn't want it, and it needs to be done. So for that reason, I would support it. And for the other reason as well, is it not ambitious enough for the environment? Well, if you have the Green Party in government and they're not ambitious enough for the environment, I mean, where the hell do you go?
What I see coming here now is that there's every opportunity now for national politicians in Ireland to claim any successes of this as an Irish government achievement and blame any negatives as something that the EU is imposing. So if you say that all of the farmers in the west of Ireland have to shoulder the environmental thing, it will be this EU law that's coming down.
Oh, it will, yeah.
Flanagan.
And let's be honest, you'd have people like me, let's be honest, 6 years ago, coming out saying that, because I wouldn't have understood it well enough, and I would have blamed Europe. And believe me, after listening to Ursula von der Leyen today, I have lots of problems with this project. But this is not one of the problems. Definitely not one of the problems. So they have the choice to do this right, or if they have the choice to not do it.
Yeah.
They have the choice to be ambitious with it, or they have the choice to fudge it. And the freedom that they have now is phenomenal when it comes to the environment, because there's a thing called land eligibility. It's basically, it's the foundation of whether you can get any grant or not. And there has been something put into land eligibility now that basically, an agricultural activity as well, that means that producing something for the environment, biodiversity, carbon sequestration, etc., that now is classified as an agricultural activity.
Okay, so you can get paid for doing that stuff.
This thing of, well, we can't do it, the scope is phenomenal. What you would say, the negative you would say about this thing is that we weren't ambitious enough at this level. But it does give them freedom to be very, very ambitious on this. There's also been a new thing put in there, and this was an amendment that we put in, and a few other people put in, and I was working with the World Agroforestry Institute and a fellow called Patrick Verms. Now, in land eligibility, agroforestry is mentioned, so that your land will now be eligible. You won't get some inspector come along and say, there's too many trees there and that tree is shading over that area. That's not eligible and this isn't eligible. You will now be able to say, well, sorry, that's an agroforestry system and you will be eligible. So this is possible.
Right.
And there's one other thing that was put into it. And it doesn't get mentioned in our draft plan in Ireland, along with agroforestry, it doesn't get mentioned, is a thing called paludiculture. Paludiculture is farming on wetlands and water buffalo. That's paludiculture. You've got horsetail. You can grow that by paludiculture. I think you can get between 4,000 and 5,000 euro per hectare of it. So you can go down that road of paludiculture. So in other words,
rather than draining your wetlands and
rather than
destroying
draining it,
Yeah.
or rather than not reflooding it,
Yeah.
it could be reflooded, and you can farm in that area using machinery that's tailored to it, and you can have a situation there whereby you preserve the wetlands and the peatlands, but you also preserve the people in the area as well, and human activity as well. And there is massive opportunities there now to go down that road because I know what they're thinking in the Golden Vale. This doesn't affect us. And you can see why I might be a fan of it because we've got a lot of wetlands.
Yeah.
But the reality is, look at the way the climate is going. Look at the graphs you can see modelling the amount of rainfall we're going to get. And you look at the landscape in Ireland, how it's predicted in 60 and 70 years' time.
More wetlands.
Those people in the Golden Vale, instead of in the background fighting against us, looking for money to incentivise paludiculture, should be saying, give it to them. They're going to show us the way in the future because humans are going to have to live in Ireland. And if you flood the lands and you don't go with a model whereby you can also, I'm not saying everywhere, but in places where you can carry out paludiculture, well, then you're just going to, maybe some people think this is a good thing. You're not going to have any humans there, but you need to bring people with you. And to me, a just transition isn't saying, I'm flooding your land, now bugger off and your grandchildren will thank me. You need to put together a system like that. But sadly, it wasn't mentioned in the draft plan. I put it in my submission that we go down that road because we've got to go down that road.
You're talking about the national level plan now.
The national level plan, yeah, because it's there in the architecture of the CAP strategic plan that will go through.
So at an EU level it's there, but it's up for the Irish government to sort of take that.
Yeah. And that derogation that we got a thing called a footnote put in on the GAIAC, which is basically the conditionality around farming on peatlands and wetlands, that an agricultural activity be maintained. Not because I wanted an agricultural activity maintained because we shall continue doing what we're doing. And my children and their children having no place to live. No, it's because I think the only way is, no more than if you want to preserve the lion or the tiger, you've got to make it more valuable for the people in the area to have it alive than dead.
Right.
And then I can guarantee you'd see a situation in 10 years' time where you'd have guys standing at their land going, if you come in and drain my land, you'll pay the price.
Right.
They will be adamant about something that's maintained, meaning they can live in the area in the future. So paludiculture is mentioned in there as an option. That all needs to be thrown into the plan. Or it could be a total disaster if they go with the minimums. They go with the minimum convergence, it'll be better than it is now, and they go with minimum redistribution, the minimum of everything they can do. Well, then it wouldn't be a good idea.
Then it won't end up as a good cap.
No, it won't end up as a good cap.
It can be a good cap, but it's sort of it's in the Irish government's hands now to sort of make it.
It's in all governments' hands. Like you look at the German government already. Sure, they have the eco schemes ready to go, and they're going for 30%. And sure, if they could go higher, they would.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't have any worries about them. You'd have worries about other countries, but I think you need to be realistic anyway. If you force countries to do anything, no more than if you tell a child he has to eat his dinner, half it'll end up on the ground, some will end up on the edge of the plate, and some under the plate. And you spend all your time trying to force them to do something they're not going to do. So really, these plans are a good idea. You can get people to do the right thing, and if they're not doing the right thing, you can say, well, this is how you can do it. And in the end, then, if they don't do the right thing, you don't give them the money for the eco schemes. You take it back and you give it to other countries, and they'll get their act together then, like, you know.
I have a question for you. So the way that you described it, right, is that you were basically elected as a Eurosceptic, but over the last few years, you've kind of evolved in your idea of how the EU works, how legislation is made, the work of the European Parliament, because you've had this experience of actually making the law, pushing through this convergence thing, and something that you like has come out of it. Would you still describe yourself as a Eurosceptic today?
Yeah, I'm a skeptic on pretty much everything. I think it's a healthy position to take. It means,
but a Eurosceptic, though, are you a Eurosceptic?
Yeah, I am on an awful lot of the project. But when it comes to agriculture, when it comes to climate change, I think it can be a really, really good project. When it comes to European defence, I do not think it's a good idea. If they want to defend Europe, let them set up a separate organisation, separate from the EU, and not to go down that road.
The way you described it, like, all of it is based on forming this consensus. Like, you had to make alliances. I mean, nothing can happen that the member states don't want to happen, right? It's up to the member states to actually decide what Europe is, right?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say it was so much driven by that on defence.
Okay.
I'd say there are bigger forces at work. But look, what I boil it down to is, in the long term, what's going to be good for the EU. And what's good for the EU is we have a sustainable food system. Mm-hmm. What I've learned from the North is the less guns, the less bombs, the less bullets you have, the better. Mm-hmm. It doesn't bring more peace. You're not more secure the more defence projects that you put together.
Right.
You're more secure if people have full bellies and they're content and they're happy. That's when you're more secure. And put money into education, put money into health, put money into climate, put money into food. But don't put money into weapons industry and going down that road, because really, I found the speech that von der Leyen made this morning a little disturbing.
This was the State of the Union address. It's like a yearly thing that the President of the EU Commission gives, where they sort of lay out aspirations. I mean, it was quite focused on defence. Everybody's talking about defence because of Afghanistan.
Well, not so much that it was so focused on defence. It was so much focused on how great we are. We're the best at this. We're the best at that. We're the best at this. And if Boris Johnson was saying that, I'd run for the telly and turn that nationalistic rubbish off. I don't want to hear how we are better than everyone else. We are better at this. We are better at that. We are the leaders in this. How about we're going to work with people on this? We're going to work with people on that. We're all going to try and lift all boats together. But all I heard this morning was how the European way of life is better. Can you imagine if you had a leader of a country standing up going, our way of life is better than anyone else's. Ireland is better.
Some of them do.
Ireland is better than this. Ireland is better than that.
Yeah.
It sounds... nationalism leads to pain and unhappiness, so she's no need to go down that road. Right. So, but I have to say, when it comes to agriculture, I mean, all I can deal with what's happened in front of me. Mm-hmm. And I got a lot more cooperation I did here than I did at home. I'm not saying that it's perfect, because going into the committee vote that time, whereby we tried to get the big groups to agree to the 100% convergence, they ran off and went behind our backs, put together a compromise amendment that said it agreed with the Commission, and it was only because we worked really, really hard to convince the Greens to come along with us and put in another compromise amendment that would have changed. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't all sweetness and light. It's never going to be, and no one should be naive enough to think that. But there are quite a lot of times where people don't answer you because they don't have the courage to tell you they're not supporting you. And to be quite honest, that's a silly way to go. Mm-hmm. But overall, I'd have to say my mandate has had more impact than I thought it would. Mm-hmm. I expected to be coming out here as my job would be to agitate for change. My job would be to inform people what was going on, and that would have done me, because I think that would be important for people. Did I think I would have a legislative footprint, stealing Marion Harkin's phrase? I didn't, but I will. That's a bonus, so that's a good thing. So I'm delighted I ran for election in the first place. I'm delighted I ran for election in 1999 to the European Parliament. And I think it was definitely a good move.
Right.
And I enjoy doing politics out here way more than I did in the Dáil.
Really? Why?
Yeah.
What's the difference? What's the difference in how you're treated? You were talking about legislative
People in
process
the
and stuff.
European Parliament don't judge you on the way you look. When you're in the Dáil or when you're in Leinster House, it's just constant remarks, constant subtle comments, constant reminder that they think you're the scum of the earth. I never get that out here.
More respect.
Way more respect. And I'm not going around banging the table going, I deserve respect. I get it, and it's nice.
Well, that was a really fascinating chat. And I think that we covered a whole bunch of really good issues. And it's great to break down the cap. I think these acronyms that we throw around are sort of a barrier to understanding something that's actually, you know, forms not only people's lives, people's livelihoods, but like the structure of our economy, how much we pay for things, like I was saying. So, Luke Flanagan, thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate you coming down for the chat. And yeah, I should let you get back to your time in the chamber.
All right.
Cool.
Thank you, Naomi.
Thank you.
I enjoyed that.
Brilliant. I'll stop the live.
I'm now going, what did I not say? Anyway, was that all right, was it?
Yeah.
And thanks for not getting lost.